Hello, it's RJ, and this is my capstone, Democracy from Athens to New Echota. Um, the reason that I started thinking about this was trying to expand upon the initial ideas of our class, which is comparing the Athenian and Roman government to the American government that we know and have today. And I believed that the Cherokee Nation was a really important addition to this because by the 19th century, they have a written constitution that's fairly similar to our constitution and is based on certain Greco-Roman ideals while still retaining their indigeneity and culture. And as it's using Greek and Roman ideas, I think that it should also be compared to Athenian and Roman societies and governments. But that is a huge topic. And so for the purposes of this paper, I'm looking at voting process, from who could vote to how easy it was to vote, because those aren't necessarily the same thing. I mean, we saw it in our own election in 2020. You have the ability to vote, but if your polling place is, got a 12-hour line, then that might not be the case. But what makes this a really good point of comparison between the three societies is that all three of them have about the same definition of a citizen who could vote, is a freed adult male citizen. And those are the people that can cast ballots. So it makes a good point of comparison. I will explain this briefly just because it's not as known, but the Cherokee Nation was initially a conglomeration of towns united by a shared culture, history, and language. As colonizing powers become more prominent on the American continent, they start to coalesce and you start to see leaders taking over most of the towns. But for the purposes of this paper, we're mostly looking at the 1820s and 30s, which is 1827, they ratified their Constitution, and that's where it's all written down, and it's one of the primary sources for this paper. But very quickly, if you look at this map, there's a lot of numbers, you don't need to pay attention to most of them, but 36 is what the Cherokee Nation is by the time of their constitution. All of the other land had to be sold at various points, including where I'm at in Asheville, and Asheville itself was ceded in two treaties, the Treaty of 1795 and the Treaty in 1798. But, considering how large the Cherokee holdings were at one point in history, we're looking just at 36. It's a much smaller state. But what is important is that the Cherokee people are adopting Greco-Roman ideas and they're becoming educated in Western histories. So parts of the Cherokee population in the 1700s and the 1800s became Western educated through different schools. They were quite fond of education and, consider themselves educated before colonizers came. And then when colonizers came and brought different knowledge, they became educated in that too. They use at least one Latin term in their constitution, the term "vivo voce," which is a legal term describing how you cast a vote with a living voice, meaning that you speak your vote and someone writes the results down. But they choose to use that Latin term in their English version of their constitution, which is pretty important because it shows that they're knowledged in Latin, at least ideas, if not the language. And you get instances of two authors submitting letters in the Cherokee State newspaper under Greek and Latin pseudonyms, specifically Socrates and Publius, which aren't common names at the time. And it shows that there are certain Cherokee that are aware of these and they are using them as rhetorical devices, specifically Socrates. It's a series of 4 treatises on freedom. So they're using these ideas from the Greek and Roman world to represent themselves. This is a portrait of the Cherokee president during the time, and he is Western educated and he's a pretty important figure during all this. So switching course here. We're starting with the Athenian democracy. It is the oldest one. I just wanted to give a brief overview of what that was. But in the Athenian voting system, there's about 250 to 300,000 people in the city-state during the 5th century, which is the majority of the democracy and the point that I'm focusing on. You have a voting population of about 20 to 40,000, while you have a slave population of 80 to 100,000 people. This is pretty drastic. You have far more slaves than you do voters. And I think just not even going into, anything else, that's a problem if you're a democracy. And it's something that's pretty noteworthy. But it also means that, only 10 to 25% of the city could vote at all. Male citizens were paid for their votes, which is pretty cool, and it ensures that poor citizens could participate. And voting in the assembly, which is a way to directly vote on laws in Athens, required 6,000 citizens, which means that at least 12 to 20% of those male citizens would have to be represented in order to pass a law, which is important because, as we'll see in the Roman system, it at least makes sure that there's some representation. And then the voting districts were divided by population and not land, which is also important because it makes sure that everyone's vote is equal. We're seeing those issues now with the United States where, certain states, your vote is worth a lot more than others. And so this is a very quick quote by Aristotle on the Athenian, in his translation or his writing on the Athenian Constitution. And one of the issues with the Athenian democracy is that certain positions were limited to an old aristocracy, and this is one of them. The Areopagus is like a Supreme Court, and to be in it, you had to be a noble. But it's important because it shows that Athenians are recognizing some of the flaws in their own democratic system. They don't recognize all the ones that we would think of today, but they are recognizing that there are some issues with it. And then next we go to Roman voting and democracy. And we're mostly looking 1st century here just because of our abundance of written sources. 1st century BCE. So in 28 BCE, there are 3 million slaves and 4 million freed people. This does not include citizens, just people that aren't slaves. And again, similar to the Athenian democracy, just by that fact alone, it's not democratic. 3 million people just straight up out of the box don't have a vote. And I have to jump around a few decades before that point, but I think the numbers are still relevant. In 70 and 69 BCE, there's only 910,000 registered voters, which is a very small fraction of the society that, Rome had. But the bigger issue is the polling place limitations. The Campus Martius, which is the largest polling place, could only hold between 55 and 70,000 people. So votes were held for one day. 55 to 70,000 people could vote, and that's it. Which means, and that is the largest polling place. There are smaller ones, which means in the elections, mostly the tribal elections, only 6% of the voters could vote. And that is already a very small fraction of people. And when they voted for consuls, which are equivalent to presidents, roughly, only 1 to 2% of registered voters could cast a ballot, just because of the size limitations of where they were voting. Furthermore, like how we divide up our states and districts, It was based off of land, not population, which means if you were in certain districts, your vote counted a lot more, which is a pretty bad, pretty bad thing. And similarly, we have a quote by a Roman source, Marcus Tullius Cicero, the brother of the politician, who talks about how the system is flawed because of how few people could vote, and because voting was literally only done in the city of Rome for the entire lands and holdings of Rome. The nobility and the rich had massive amounts of power over who got into office. And so Marcus Tullius Cicero is writing a kind of treatise on how to win an election in this somewhat rigged system. And he notes pretty specifically that you need to make friends with the rich in order to get in office. It's not necessarily saying that he has an issue with this. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but it is showing that the Romans are aware that the system is unequally balanced in who could vote. And so we get back to the Cherokee Nation and their voting system. They have a much smaller slave population in comparison to the other two. So the Cherokee Nation, by the 1835 census, has roughly 1,600 African-American slaves in a population of 18,000. So much smaller, about one slave per 10 people, which is drastically less than the other two. It is really important to note just how much that changes your representation. The Cherokee Nation also had a large amount of polling places. They had at least 16 polling places, and they have in their constitution the ability to grant and create more if need was there. And out of those 16,000 people that weren't slaves within the nation, you have a pretty large voting base. And I estimate, roughly using censuses and some other stuff, that 33 to 38% of the population could vote. This doesn't mean that they did, but because there's so many polling places and because there's so many citizens in the Cherokee Nation, it is almost completely made up of citizens. You have a much better amount of the population that can be represented directly. Similar to the Roman system, the districts, there's 8 districts in the Cherokee Nation, are divided by land, not by population. But similar to the Athenian voting system, you weren't compensated for voting, but you were compensated if you become a legislative member. You get money to make sure that any Cherokee could run for those offices. And here you have, I think this is pretty cool. It took a little while to find it, but a actual clip of one of the sections in the Cherokee Constitution, printed in the state newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix. And you can see Constitution of the Cherokee Nation and Article 4, and then you see the Cherokee equivalent right next to it, which is pretty fantastic. And here's a quote by an individual. I don't believe that they're a politician of any type, but I couldn't find much about the name, to be honest. Writing in the Cherokee Phoenix in the communications column, Echota, and he talks about how the committee should be composed of men of Western education. The committee's like the Senate, roughly, and the council's like the House. Well, the council should be composed of full-blooded Cherokees known for the love of country. And I think that's really important because he's getting to this idea of partial assimilation, saying that, we should have Western educated people guide us on how to do certain things because, they were partially assimilated into Western culture and they needed that. On the other hand, we can't lose who we are in our government, and the Cherokee people as a culture still need to be represented, which I think is one of the most powerful points about the Cherokee Nation that I found in my research, outside of how many people could be represented for the time period. And so conclusions, representation is really important in democratic governments. And I think it's one of the, core focuses of how a democracy, gets the will of the people enforced. Um, the Cherokee Nation uses some Greco-Roman ideas while making their democracy, and I think it's justified to compare them to those as a pseudo-Western democracy. But what makes them both powerful and resilient and just very interesting to study is that they retain their indigenous origins in the face of genocide and forced assimilation by the USA. And their democracy, even though it is almost verbatim like ours, faced constant pressure from the USA during this time period. And they get removed from that plot 36 in 35 through the Trail of Tears. And it is also important to show that they're using Greco-Roman ideas, but they are, I'll move this up. The Cherokee Nation was more representative than Rome, way more representative than Rome. And it is still more representative than Athens. Just there's more citizens, and it is, really, it's a place where your vote mattered more than the other two cultures. So the rest is sources. Thank you for that.